good evening, everyone. We'll just get a start this evening. Welcome along to the fourth series of the Sustainable Sheep Systems, which is funded by the Farm Advisory Service. My name is Hazel Lawton from SAC Consulting, and I'll be your chairperson for this evening. So before we go on to series 4, I would just like to recap what we've produced in the previous 3 series. So there's been 15 webinars and some supporting publications, videos and podcasts on a wide range of topics surrounding sheep systems. So these can be found on the FAS website on the Sustainable Sheep Systems page, and there's also a playlist of all the previous webinars and videos on the YouTube channel. Now, we talk about sustainability quite a lot, and it's normally thought of as a more long-term goal for many businesses, but in agriculture, it's a very real element on a daily basis, and it's influenced and to an extent threatened by a number of factors, some within our control and some out with our control. Sorry. Obviously, the weather and what we get for market prices are sort of 2 of those larger factors that we can't control. So from series 1 to 3, we've spoken about things that are within our control. So series 1 was mainly on maximising performance. Series 2 was sort of a grazing mini-series, and series 3 was a health campaign which looked at disease risk. And at the end of that there, Daniel did a really good presentation on low labour genetics, starting to look at how we can influence genetics to make systems simpler and mitigate some of the other risks that we hold. So economic, environment and health are 3 of the 4 pillars that make up sustainability. So we've covered those, and for this series, series 4, we're going to look at one of the factors that we to an extent can't control, which is the consumer acceptability. So what their perceptions are and expectations are of what we produce and how we produce it. So we've got 4 very topical webinars coming up this winter. The impact of sheep farming on the climate, which is this evening's one, the impact of antibiotic use on human health, welfare of tail docking and castration, and finally the impact of protein production on the environment. So this evening we have got 2 excellent speakers joining us to introduce the concept of the consumer and look at their expectations of how sheep farming impacts the climate. So in a slight change to this evening's lineup, we're going to start off with Ian McDonald from QMS. So Ian has been analysing beef, lamb and pork markets for QMS for nearly 15 years, and he's supported by a marketing team that's always trying to keep on top of what's happening in the consumer environment to keep the QMS advertising campaigns relevant. And after Ian, we have Liz Genever, who is based down in East Midlands, and she's an independent beef and sheep consultant and has a vast knowledge on many aspects of beef and sheep farming. She's done a lot of research work and a lot of work within commercial companies on a wide range of topics, and she likes to challenge the norm. She also, some of you may recognise her from hosting the Carbon Calling podcast, and she's just about to launch a new one, Sheep Geeks. So we're interested to listen to that. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and pass you over to Ian, who'll take you through the first part of the webinar.
Okay, yeah, good evening. So yeah, I'm here to talk about an overview of what's happening with consumer trends and why meeting consumers' expectations are important at farm level. So yeah, I guess when we think about sustainability, there's wide range of definitions of the term. There probably isn't one exact definition, and it can encompass environment, also things like economic sustainability, financial sustainability of businesses. But I think this presentation is really kind of focusing in on that sort of environmental sustainability aspect. But yeah, you can also include things like animal welfare in there, the local impact on your environment, whereas as well as kind of the wider global impact. And yeah, I guess while shoppers are pretty, some level of shoppers are sort of driven purely by environmental impact. a lot of others, it's more about animal welfare and the local economy, wanting to support local farmers when they're purchasing their food. Obviously, things like cost are a big driver of many people's purchases, but certainly a significant proportion will be driven by some more sustainability requirements, I guess, tend to be towards the sort of upper end of the income scale, and yeah, have a bit more money to spend on discretionary purchases. On the sheep side in particular, I guess, well, there is that sort of sustainability reporting requirements which are coming in and likely to come in given more importance in the future. I guess at the moment, there's maybe a little bit less on the sheep side than in the beef sector. Kind of beef's almost that sort of market leader. There's if you look at down the supermarket aisles, a much bigger proportion of shelf space is dedicated towards beef. And I guess when retailers are looking at their overall carbon footprint, it's that kind of because there's a higher level of sales through beef than lamb, then that's a bigger part of their overall emissions. But like as beef is kind of I guess the market leader on that side at the moment, then it's sheep will is likely to follow because that's the kind of general direction of travel. And I guess as well as thinking about sustainability for the domestic consumer, we also need to think about exports because exports are roughly a third of sheep sheep meat output. So yeah, it's that kind of overseas consumer, particularly in Europe, that's also important. So yeah, the presentation is just going to go into these topic areas and kind of focus in on them a little bit more. So taking that sort of drivers of consumer purchasing decisions first, obviously household finances is quite a key driver for many shoppers. And what have we got at the moment? Well, consumer confidence levels are, I guess, relatively weak. However, a lot of that is more to do with kind of feelings about the general economy rather than perhaps their own personal financial situation. And actually, when you look at kind of measures of consumer confidence, when people are talking about their own sort of personal finances, it's a much more balanced position on net. And if we think about it, that's kind of an average position of people are fairly confident on average, or at least not negative on average, then there's going to be a significant proportion above the line and got a bit more disposable income to spend. And then if we look at kind of levels of wage growth compared with living costs, actually for the last 18 months, wages have been rising faster than the level of prices. And it's been, yeah, sort of it come down from sort of 6% last autumn towards maybe 4 to 5% now. And whereas inflation is running at more like 2 to 3%. So yeah, people do have a bit more money to spend at the moment. So there's yeah, I guess the gloom is moving around the overall economy rather than personal finances. As we look forward, there's maybe a bit of uncertainty around current direction with the budget, and I guess those impacts haven't really been felt yet. Interestingly, the GfK consumer confidence survey, it actually picked up a little bit of an improvement this month following the budget, which I guess some people might not have been expecting. But yeah, I guess as disposable incomes rise, that's when shoppers are more likely to put a stronger weight on considerations other than the price of the product and how much they're paying for it. So, as Hazel pointed out at the start, our marketing team at QMS, we're always trying to keep on top of what's happening with consumers, and that helps us to keep our advertising campaigns relevant. So this year we had some research carried out for us, and yeah, it was all about what are the most important factors when people are buying their meat. And unsurprisingly, a lot of it was about the quality of the product and the taste. The price was important, but also where it's sourced from was also important. Interestingly, if you look at kind of, I guess, that sort of younger demographic, health and well-being of the animals was actually quite important. So that's animal welfare. But yeah, origin, very important because people do want to support their local farmers. We always find that in consumer research. Interestingly, people's, I guess, idea of what quality is, it's more than just what it tastes like. It's also some of those factors like animal welfare and the way it's produced is also a factor there, which is quite interesting. And then when you kind of look at some sort of, I guess, wider measure, ask them what are the most important things when they're purchasing. Um, Price is obviously at the top, but then you do get things like sustainability. Even though only 5% said it was the most important thing, 80% still said that it was important to them, which is, yeah, quite interesting. So yeah, people tend to have a lot of factors in their head when they're buying. It's not just one thing, but I guess a good chunk people price will be most important, but then people with a bit more disposable income, I guess foodie type people might be a bit more thinking about other stuff in there. And yeah, as part of our research, I guess we sort of look to sort of split some of the demographics down, and I guess one of our key targets at the moment is conscious lifestylers. So that's the people that are maybe a little bit more affluent, tend to be a little more affluent, have got a bit more money to spend on food, and they tend to they're thinking more about health and well-being, and that kind of, I guess, sustainability when they're purchasing. And actually, it's more that sort of quality assurance of the product and where it's produced is maybe a little bit higher than sustainability, but sustainability is still fairly important. And then even if you kind of compare that against the non-conscious lifestyles, that's the rest of shoppers. Even 45% of them said that sustainability is important, which is quite, yeah, that's pretty interesting because those shoppers are the ones that are tending to be a bit more driven by price. And so, yeah, interestingly, there's signs that retailers are sort of adjusting what they do to those, I guess, some consumer noise and some campaigns. And we've always seen that plastic packaging, and people really want that to be reduced. They see plastic as the major issue, I'd say, over emissions. And so we've seen that in the last couple of years. Really, Sainsbury's were maybe the first to adopt the sort of new mince packs with vacuum packed, and then Tesco of pillow packs in a bit of innovation, and that's really common across the retailers now. So that's one good example of retailers responding. And if you look on the Sainsbury's website, you can find evidence of their sort of, I guess, their producer groups and what they're trying to do there, and lower carbon beef, and commitments on sourcing deforestation-free products in their supply chain. So again, that's their sort of, they've heard that people are kind of against deforestation, and it's something they're going to try and do about, and kind of moving ahead of legislation. So yeah, I guess as well as sustainability, cost is important, and when you are, I guess, the way that Farmgate prices and then that's passed through to the retail prices, that those sharp rises we've seen in recent years, products are much more expensive, and I guess when shoppers are at the shelf thinking, that really is quite pricey now. And I would imagine that for a lot of shoppers, that'll start to think when that price point is there. How is it produced? Where does it come from? And that kind of thing. And hoping that the taste is going to be good for that I guess almost investment in that product that they're buying. So that's where that kind of, I guess, at farm level, that starts to become important, the way that products are produced. And we obviously have a really good story to tell over that in Scotland. And I guess on a similar line, if you're kind of comparing where our prices are with beef side with Ireland, and on the lamb side with Australia and New Zealand, there's quite a pricing gap at the moment. And I guess that kind of local premium, that's make consumers really think, actually, is that difference in prices, that actually, is it worth it? And I guess at the moment we do have that good story to tell. So we would argue that yes, and you guys are obviously jumping through a lot of extra hoops as well to sort of drive that price premium and kind of deserve it as well. But that's definitely something that needs to be considered. And so another part of the spec, I guess, is carbon audits. And I guess from a sort of I guess layman's perspective, I'd just been assuming that kind of carbon auditing would be coming in equally in beef and sheep. However, I've been led to believe that it's being adopted more slowly across the sheep sector, and some research on this has given me good insight as to why that's happening. Maybe it wasn't quite the reasons that I maybe thought would be the case. And certainly one view I had was that it's actually the kind of consultants and the company processing companies are finding it easier to apportion their emissions in beef enterprise on the farm rather than sheep, with I guess a few different things going on there. And some of that's even just the production cycle, 6 to 9 months, rather than like a cattle system where it's longer. And I guess if people are selling at different points of the year, and sometimes you're selling ahead of Christmas, sometimes moving into the next year. Yeah, so that there's things like that are causing challenges. There was also a view that some of it's down to it's easier to sort of separate beef into different farming systems, where sheep is kind of store lamb finishing maybe, but then the other systems all kind of roll into one a bit more. Rather than beef, you got dairy beef or cereal finishing or grazing finishing and that kind of thing. And also, it was suggested that you need to make a lot more assumptions when you're putting into your calculations on the sheep side. I don't know if some of that's down to, I guess in beef, if you've got records of when animals are born, whereas in sheep, it's more of a, I guess, more of a guess at times, certainly on the birth date. However, I guess as with all things, if one sector is kind of adopted ahead, then the others are going to follow. So I imagine that kind of direction travels there. So sheep will start to become more of a focus. As well as the process, it's, I guess, the optics at the moment. Beef has been the focus of the environmental NGOs, and kind of all the pressure has been on beef. And again, with beef taking up a much higher share of retail shelf space, that's why beef has kind of been done first. But I think sheep is definitely it's starting to be done, and it's kind of going to become more common going forward. But I think if I guess one kind of simple indicator of sustainability in the sheep sector that I always tend to look at is just the kind of lambing rate over time. Because a few years ago, I noticed that actually it has been trending higher in Scotland, which I guess is a positive thing. We're tending to become a bit more efficient over time, and I guess when you're producing more lambs per ewe, that means more meat per ewe, and you're spreading those emissions from the ewe flock across more sheep. So that is definitely a positive story that we've got up here. So that kind of at the start I was pointing out that sustainability is more than just the domestic consumer. It's also important to think about exports. And yeah, on the sheep side, we're probably about 30% of our production is exported at the moment, and that's it's kind of certainly a growing part of the business in Scotland. When we surveyed our processors ahead of the international trade show in Paris in October, we found a surge of about 50% in our beef and lamb and this quarter exports over the past year. Some of that's new companies kind of getting into exporting for the first time, and some changes in business structure. But it kind of highlights that there's a lot of demand out there for our products. And some of that is that in Europe on the beef and lamb side, they're starting to get nervous about supplies and where the product's going to come from, given that demand is holding up, and so businesses there are looking for alternative suppliers. And just to kind of highlight the EU trade is really dominating the export trade for our Scottish processors. It's really way over 95% of the sort of beef and lamb trade. A bit less in the offal side, but certainly for beef and lamb, it really is mostly into the EU. And why is that kind of important on the sustainability side? Well, that's really down to lots of due diligence reporting requirements in the EU, which are, I guess, from on the back of the EU Green Deal, which kind of came into place during COVID with the reform of their common agricultural policy system. And a lot of these new policies are kind of coming in stages. Some of them being watered down a bit from what's first being proposed, but it's that direction of travel. They're all kind of certainly on the way, and it means that companies really need to sort of focus on where they're sourcing products from, and this deforestation regulation, which I kind of at the moment beef is part of. Yeah, they're going to have to be when you're I guess it's European legislation, but it's going to apply to all products traded on the EU market. So that includes all the stuff that's imported from the UK. And I guess while beef is on at the moment and sheep's not on it, there is definite concern that over time other products will start to be hit by this. And while there's pretty limited deforestation, and certainly there's a lot of complaints in Scotland of growing trees on good productive farmland, still going to have to kind of comply with these things. And it's, yeah, not just at sort of company level, it's also the banking system, and they're going to have requirements to when they're thinking about who they're going to lend to as well. So all these challenges. So if I guess we're probably quite well ahead of the game in Scotland on some of these requirements in our farming systems. But yeah, so we kind of need to keep on top of that to ensure that kind of those export markets can be serviced. And I guess really just to sum up, I think what this tells us all is that sustainability is not the top driver of consumer buying habits, but it definitely is an important consideration. And it's that kind of, as you move up the income scale, the people with more disposable income tend to think about that a bit more. And looking ahead, the direction of travel really is for that kind of reporting to increase, not just for the processors and importers, but also the financial sector. You're making lending decisions, and that's happening here, and it's also happening for exports. And yeah, that's my final slide.
So that leads really, really nicely into Liz, who's going to give us an overview of the impact of sheep farming on the climate challenge there. So I'll hand over to you, Liz. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So, hello everybody. This is what I'm planning to talk through in the next half an hour or so. There'll be a bit of context. I've done it in a slightly different format, so it's sort of a SWOT analysis. So what are the current strengths of the sheep sector, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in relation to the sort of climate message and people's desire to think about sustainable production. There's also my version of what regen farming is. So, and we'll talk through that, and then some next steps in terms of what am I encouraging farmers to think about, and how can we sort of make this quite massive topic into things that we can do on farm in the next few months or next years or so. So talk through some graphs. I've got some graphs too. So what we generally know, and this is generally UK, and I apologize, there's quite a lot of UK and then maybe some England, but I'll explain which bit of the country I'm talking about in the various different slides. Beef and sheep is responsible for about 5.7% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture in total is around 12%. So beef and sheep production is just under 50% of that total production. For interest, the NHS is around about 5.4% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and transport sitting at 20%. So there's quite a lot of feedback in terms of agriculture is still a chunk of the greenhouse gases from the UK, but it's not the major one, yet there is this hyper focus on it. The graph on the left-hand side is talking about sheep emissions intensity. So what we can generally see when we compare ourselves to pig, beef, or dairy, we've actually seen an increase in emissions intensity per kilo, again at this overview figure compared to those other production systems. So we've increased by about 5% over this time, which is around about 30 years, while those other sectors have reduced. So that means they are, for every kilo of product they're producing, there's fewer emissions associated with it, while our emissions have increased a little by 5%. So it's slightly counter to what Ian said in terms of productivity, but it's to do with the intensity of those emissions. And then when within the DEFRA Farm Practice Survey, the question was asked about what are the main motivations for farmers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. considered it a good business practice, which technical term I'm not sure is a bit waffly in terms of what does that actually mean. There's a bit into quite a high proportion concern for the environment. Profitability sits there. Regulation to meet market demands is relatively low at what 20-ish%. So this is sort of counter to this idea of why people are doing it or focusing on it. For me, although I hate the phrase win-win, if we look at greenhouse gases, generally we can reduce cost harm, and so that's why I'm surprised why profitability is lower in this scale. And again, this is across all farming businesses rather than just a focus on beef and sheep. And as Ian hinted at, the idea that to meet market demand is likely to be increasing in the next few years just because the pull from that supply chain is going to increase. And we'll talk about why probably sheep are slightly more insulated than the beef sector on that, but I agree with Ian, it'll still come our way. The other important change that's happened in the last few years, and this is why this increased interest in carbon footprints and carbon audits is ever increasing, is companies have identified that actually offsetting their carbon emissions is actually quite expensive. So offsetting is where you might buy some trees, you might pay for someone to do a good deed somewhere else, and you offset your emissions. You don't necessarily reduce your emissions, but you're just buying in that offset. There's been a general move towards insetting, which is actually where you're trying to develop improvements within the whole supply chain. So and the hope for that is that you're actually reducing emissions in total rather than just still doing what you want to do and then just buy it in from somewhere else. So what's interesting about that is that means that they're asking the whole supply chain to be responsible for this, and it's part of it to do with how the emissions are being reported, but it's also partly due to the cost associated with that offset. And that is why we know that particularly beef and sheep or ruminant type species, that the emissions on farm is an important part of that whole products. Start again. The farm bit is a big chunk of the total. So their ability to gain emission savings when you're into processing is not as massive as we see on the farm opportunities. So again, that's changed in the last few years, and that's why people are asking slightly different questions. To counter this, and we generally get beaten around the head because we're never going to be as efficient as the pig and poultry sector in terms of emissions produced per kilo of product. What we have from a beef and sheep perspective is we are generally grazing grass. We have land available to us to offer ecosystem services. So this is a phrase that's been around for decades probably, but it's starting to actually emerge again in terms of not only are we offsetting or insetting carbon, but actually what are we doing in terms of biodiversity, water quality. So there's a general plea away from this hyper focus on carbon and realizing there's actually these wider benefits that we see on farm. And that is about water storage. It potentially is carbon storage as well. Biodiversity. So here we're talking about provisioning. So that's the products. We're also talking about regulating those environments, rather than regulations. Cultural. So again, you've got farmers who are opening or offering a diversified income source by getting people to go and experience nature on their farm. And it's also supporting that wider ecosystem through photosynthesis, biodiversity. Food is interesting because it's one of those sections. So again, it's realizing that we're now part of this bigger idea of food is important, but as is other things. What I should have said on that is what's difficult about this is how do we monitor it, and also how do we monetize it? So what are 5 red squirrels worth? And that's why the hyperfixation on carbon is because we've got a carbon market, we can now attribute a value to a ton of carbon. We can debate whether we can accurately measure it in soil, but we can put a value to it. And that's the debate in all of this, is how can we start to value some of these ecosystem services so that we can start changing how we sort of focus on maybe planting trees in that land use conflict. As ever, there's a lot of people talking about this already and have been for quite a few years. So recently, the National Sheep Association published this document, which is wider, sort of a wider look at sustainability. And within that is a crossbred ewe carbon footprint, which is a bit generic, but actually is relatively representative of what we're seeing on farm, which is probably just over 50% of those emissions are coming from enteric fermentation. That's methane. So that's the production generally from the rumen, with a small bit coming from the hindgut, and it's a byproduct of the digestion. So it's a really efficient way of processing the hydrogen gas that is an outcome of the rumination process. So that's generally over 50%, and we can see that in beef cattle systems or sheep systems. Next, we've got to read it clockwise because the colors aren't massively different. So the next big chunk is manure management. That isn't necessarily just bedding, that's also in terms of urine and dung deposition on grazing. We've then got fertilizer as a chunk, purchase feed, small amount of purchase bedding, fuel, and then other sits up there as well. So the big things that we're trying to target generally are, how do we improve the efficiency of the animal? Again, that's been talked about earlier. What are we doing in terms of manure management and fertilizer use? And what are we doing in terms of purchase feed costs? And then on the right-hand side is a graphic that comes out of Chogus, so in Ireland, and in terms of their 12 steps to reduce greenhouse gases on farm. And a lot of it is focusing on land management, so nutrient management, land management, and then this efficiency. The challenge to all of us is a lot of this we have known for decades, and we'll come back to that in a second. So none of this is new, but how do we bolt it together to make a system that's actually functioning and delivering what we need to do in terms of reducing greenhouse gases? So again, moving into the strengths and why the sheep industry is important. So the bit that is sometimes missed in some of this, the greenhouse gas chat, is around actually what we're doing within ruminants is converting human inedible protein or feeds into human edible protein. So because they're converting grass generally or forages that aren't readily digestible at all really by humans into a product that is. So when we then compare that with other sectors, and again, this paper at the top does that. So when we compare that with pig and poultry or dairy, where actually quite a lot of human edible proteins are being used within those sectors, then lamb and beef starts to be looked at more favorably. The challenge is that we're just trying to find the numbers that help us defend our argument. But again, it's thinking about actually those ruminants are providing a service for converting land that can't be used necessarily to grow other crops as well. What's also changed in the last few years, particularly in the UK, they've been able to select for low methane emitting sheep, and New Zealand have probably been looking at that for the last 15 or so years. There's a project happening in the UK at the moment called Breed for Change, and it's looking at clins, a proportion of Dorsets, some ex-Lanas, and some Innovis sheep as well. So those sheep are going through these portable accumulation chambers, and that gives an indication of how much methane they're emitting. And what we can do is then select, we can select for animals who are emitting less methane. And what the process that happens is that it appears that those animals are better at controlling the microbiome within the rumen. So they control the amount of methanogens, so the ones that are producing methane, and that's how it has its impact. With all breeding programs, we need to ensure that we don't chase for one trait. But again, there's some nice examples from New Zealand, Ireland, and Australia where they're able to select these still efficient sheep, but also producing less methane. The other thing we've got within the sheep sector, we've got real life examples of these low input systems, and that's not saying they're necessarily low output systems, but we generally know people have reduced where they've reduced fertilizer, reduced feed, focusing massively on grass and forage and making money. So it's sort of a known vision. We know where we probably need to get, which we can't always say with other sectors. So again, reminding ourselves of this. So the big chunk of what we're seeing here is some of it's coming from fertilizer and nutrient applications and a big chunk is coming from purchase feed. So how can we design systems where we're optimizing the amount of fertilizer and feed going into those systems to ensure that we're still growing the same amount of grass as we were? How can we start to reduce those inputs, write fewer checks, however you wish to refer to it? We have, as mentioned before, we generally, when we look at how we're going to do some of this on farm, we've known quite a lot of it for a while. It might have had a different guise on it. Now we're looking at it from a greenhouse gas perspective, but a lot of this is not new. Most of this is well known, and with evidence sitting beside it. And as picked up from earlier, is that what we have within the sheep sector is we know we need to do something about it, but we're currently not a target. So we're not having films made about sheep while they are within the beef cattle sector. So that allows us to get ourselves in order before the abuse that certainly the beef industry has witnessed can hopefully doesn't come our way. In terms of weaknesses, so we've identified, particularly from an emissions intensity perspective, that we haven't necessarily increased over time. So that could be that we're doing carcass weight could be affected. It could be that our breeding animals are bigger. All of those things are leading to that 5% increase in emissions intensity over that period. In terms of uptake of technical knowledge, so as I keep mentioning, we know quite a lot of what we need to do, but actually we're not necessarily doing it across the whole sector. I know there's some examples where they are, but if we look again, and this is from the farm practice survey, slightly later than one I showed before, but in terms of regular weighing, 42% of farmers are doing it, using breeding values 30%, and again this is across all farm types rather than beef and sheep. Soil mapping low, and then we're looking at pasture measurement plate meters around 9%. So I'm not saying that this is the answer to everything, but what this is indicating to me is that we know quite a lot of the information, we're not necessarily taking it up. So my question is, we'll come to, which is why, what's happening? And then in terms of potentially harshly, that how are we in terms of building our new skills? So some of this area needs us to have different skills. It needs to allow us to look at our businesses differently, engage in different conversations, and how we market our products. And again, firstly, are those skills available to us in terms of courses? Have we got farmers sort of wanting to upskill themselves and how they cope with some of these messages? We are really very aware of volatility, particularly around fertilizer prices that happened sort of 2 or so years ago now. So this graph at the bottom shows the agricultural price inflation, and with the green line being straight fertilizers. So this isn't that ironically did encourage people to change, because they weren't willing to spend the amount of money on fertilizer that they were, just because of how much the price increased. And what we saw is that probably for 2 years or so that didn't really have an impact on their business. Combine that with some wet times in the last 12 months, we're definitely seeing grass growth not performing as we did. And we need to look back and see, actually, is it a nutrient supply issue caused in part by this volatility? And sort of running through this, and I suppose link a bit more to the carbon calling work I do, which is actually how do we get some headspace to deal with some of these complex issues? And most of the time, and the inheritance tax being a really good example, is that we're sort of firefighting the next issue that's coming our way, rather than necessarily having time to think about what and how we're going to achieve what we need to achieve on farm. In terms of, we've talked about this, the opportunities for the sheep sector is a lot of these solutions are known. So we've got a lot of information in terms of the benefit of using lime, how we use our manures better on farm. How can we grow different species? So be that clover, be it chicory, be that other things that are appropriate for certain fields, but mainly about rooting depth and providing different minerals to those animals. So again, this is back to these solutions are known. There's also opportunities for farms that probably weren't here 5 to 10 years ago. So this is the example here is a biodiversity net gain. Again, some people believe it is witchcraft and don't trust them. But again, this is opportunities for farmers to use their land in different ways. So example of biodiversity net gain is now any form of development needs to not only replace what biodiversity has been damaged through that development, but also has to increase it. And sometimes that can happen on site, sometimes it's again bought in from somewhere else, and generally relatively locally to that development site. So again, opportunities, but again, we're moving into this sort of land conflict, and depending on the level of change that needs to happen, is that land still appropriate for sheep production? I do quite a lot of work on sort of mixed farms, and particularly arable farms who are putting in a lot of cover crops, mixed lays, diverse lays, and are looking for opportunities with graziers to move animals those bits of land. So again, it isn't for everybody, and some of it we still need to work out very much the finer details. But with more and more soils being challenged from a health perspective in terms of actually maintaining and having resilience of yield, we're going to see more and more cover crops going into areas, and livestock is definitely a solution that can come in, but who's going to provide it? Who's going to provide the labor? So again, there's opportunities around that. Large scale sheep businesses in the east are coming back. So certainly there's a project that's going on at the moment, which is looking at how to establish a grassland carbon code. So at the moment, we're seeing quite a lot of money going into both woodland and also peatland restoration, because there's a carbon code that sits with it. So that gives us sort of parameters of what that carbon may be increasing by. There isn't currently one for grassland, and again, that's probably why we're not seeing the sort of drive for more grassland based systems as we are when we see more trees. So we know that these are some figures about stored carbon. So grassland isn't going to be generally as high in terms of peat or woodland. Again, bracken and heathlands beat it. But however, what we're doing on grassland is we're also producing food, and we're generally producing food from human inedible and then transferring it or transforming into human edible products. So again, there's always this balancing act between how much carbon we're able to store and also the other benefits we're seeing of that land. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. So in terms of, that's what we're seeing is an opportunity around that grassland sequestration. Again, people who have engaged in carbon audits would have seen those figures for some of them farms, and realizing it is quite challenging, and because some of that carbon is quite transient depending on where it is locked up into some of those soils. What I forgot at the top was an increased demand. So I heard some figures the other day where we're probably seeing an 8% reduction in production in terms of sheep meat across the UK, and we're seeing anywhere between a 5 and 15% increase in demand for that sheep meat. So what's interesting is that and when you look across Europe, generally production is low and reducing across Europe. So we're in an opportunity where actually we're the third biggest exporter of sheep meat. So there's huge opportunities for that to happen, but it's got to be in a economically and environmentally sustainable system. The and wool is an interesting one, because particularly British wool and also finer wool. So there's a project happening called Functional Fibre, which is focusing on how can we get finer wools being produced in Britain. And again, there's a very big market for that. Big is dramatic, but it's certainly moving it from a niche. In terms of this was talked about, but land use conflict is that big threat. So where we were previously grazing sheep and cattle and dairy cows, we're now planting trees, and I don't quite understand why we can't do a bit of both. Again, this is partly driven by this having an appropriate carbon code. Land price, and although I love a high land price, as sort of hinted at from Ian's presentation, which is getting to a point where when is it starting to put off consumers? Some figures that came out recently is that around 6% of the general population eat lamb every week. So we are becoming a niche product, and our challenge with that, pushing that lamb price even further. And again, it links to that, the demand and supply I mentioned before, is that it is benefiting the farmer, but is it going to benefit long term in terms of consumers? Next generation, and I apologize for the picture of Jeremy Clarkson, but again, this is linked back to the inheritance tax debate, not a debate, the inheritance tax policy change that's happened, and how this has really shook the confidence of that next generation, and the sort of concerns about the viability of some of those farms potentially. Carbon taxes are also coming on fertilizer, so they're coming into the new year, and again, this is about incentivizing people to change practice. Challenge is the incentive is there, but the support of how you change isn't necessarily always there. So again, that's potentially encouraging people to develop other ways of thinking. How can we use legumes? How can we look at what soil biology can do or can't do for us? And again, I've mentioned a vegan, but what I was interested in, I went to a side point, but I went to a vegan discussion group the other day at a vegan restaurant, and I also went to a wildlife trust talk in the same week, and both times when I introduced myself as a farmer, there was like a sharp intake of breath. So for me, I think part of it is that we do need to get out and engage with a range of different people that isn't just farmers, to understand what we're up to. So I think the threat is if we don't do that, and the inheritance tax is a nice example of, there's a lot of people trying to understand what it means and why farmers are so angry, and I don't think we're communicating that as effectively as we should be. So very, not quite quickly, but this, thank you to Russ for this slide. So when we segue into what is regenerative, so what I think is important when we're talking regenerative is that most people, again, focus on soil, maybe organic matter, maybe carbon sequestration. But for me, the reason why I'm interested in regenerative approaches is that it allows us to think very much wider about what we're trying to achieve on that farm. Profit does come into it, but also how are we looking at our soil? How are we changing? How are we manage it so we are holding on to more water, or that or land is more resilient to high rainfall? What are we doing in terms of biodiversity? Social impacts, so that could be the health of people around you in terms of accessing food off your land. Doesn't mean that everyone has to direct supply, but what are the impacts of the food you're producing onto the wider health? And thinking, how can we use some of this to diversify incomes? And that's not necessarily encouraging everybody to have an Airbnb, but actually there's a growing massive interest in terms of nature being outside, what the value of farmers can be. So how can we capitalize on that? And so, yeah, the question to ask yourself is, what are we trying to regenerate? Is it ourselves? And some of the carbon calling stuff we do is actually about people's own happiness, that a lot of farmers are miserable and we don't talk about that bit. So, and how can we get happy farmers and profitable farms? So in terms of the next steps, so I was involved in a course with Nicole Masters, and these are some of the questions, and I'll leave them up for a second. These are some of the questions that I use with farmers in terms of trying to get a better understanding of why they're doing what they do. And the challenge are sort of alluding to, which is greenhouse gases could be just another thing we hit farmers with in terms of, well, you're not doing good enough. You're now releasing emissions. So what I've hinted at is that actually, if we get that farming system really, really rolling in terms of reducing inputs, high productivity type farming, we get the benefits in terms of reduced greenhouse gas intensity. So this is about what's working well, what's not working well on that farm, and what is the plan for that farm. And what's interesting is when you ask people that question number 4, they can't always visualize it. They might have it in their heads, but they can't visualize what that long-term vision is for the farm. So some of this is encouraging this long-term thinking, this wider thinking about what the farm can achieve. Greenhouse gases is part of it, but there's other things that also need to sit alongside it. So in summary, we know how to design a net zero carbon farm or a regen farm. We can map it out, we can understand the metrics, we can do all sorts of things we know what it could look like. And the tools are getting better. So we've got satellite imaging that wasn't available to us before in terms of biomass. in terms of indicating soil carbon. We've got new EBVs on methane. We've got feed supplementation that could help to reduce methane. But we don't know how to get most of those farmers to do it. And I don't think it's definitely not a limitation of knowledge. We know quite a lot of what we need to do. What we need to work on is how we get that mindset, determination, and making those more difficult decisions to happen on farm. And an unanswerable question at the moment is how do we balance that wider benefits of reduced emissions, improved biodiversity with food production? And they don't have to be in conflict, but we do need to work out where that sweet spot is. Thank you.